The village was cloaked in a heavy silence that night, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes every breath feel like a burden. Underneath the pale light of a dying moon, shadows stretched long and ominous, creeping over cracked earth and broken dreams. Here lived a young woman named Amara, whose life was entwined with pain and silence, bound by chains far heavier than those made of iron. She was no stranger to suffering, for her days had become a bleak ritual of survival under the oppressive gaze of a man who wielded control like a weapon. Amara's eyes, once bright with hope and laughter, now held a dullness born of years spent beneath his shadow. His presence was a constant, suffocating weight that threatened to consume her completely. This man, cold, cruel, and unyielding, had claimed dominion over her body and spirit, bending her to his will with a relentless cruelty that left her gasping for air. But on this night, the darkness was deeper, the air heavier, for he had prepared something more sinister than the usual torment. He forced her to drink ashes. The ashes were cold, dry, and bitter, remnants of fire long extinguished. They crumbled on her tongue like death itself, a bitter taste that clung to her throat and settled deep inside. To others, ashes might have seemed meaningless, mere dust scattered by the wind, but in this moment, they were a cruel symbol of destruction and erasure. He sought to strip Amara of her identity, her voice, and her very essence. To force her to swallow the remnants of what once burned brightly was to demand that she extinguish her own light, to vanish beneath the weight of despair. Yet, beneath the surface of her torment, a flicker of something stronger began to stir. The ashes, instead of silencing her, ignited a spark deep within, a power she had yet to understand but one that pulsed with the promise of defiance. It was as if the very remnants of fire he made her consume had awakened a force that no cruelty could snuff out. The village around them seemed oblivious, wrapped up in its own fears and superstitions, blind to the silent war unfolding behind closed doors. Few knew of Amara's ordeal, and fewer still dared to intervene. The man's cruelty was veiled in the guise of tradition and power, masking the true horror of what he inflicted. But the ashes, cold, unforgiving, were more than a punishment. They were a key unlocking something ancient and fierce. As Amara swallowed the ashes, the bitter taste of death was tempered by a strange warmth that spread through her lungs and heart. It was a breath not of surrender but of resistance, a fire that refused to die. In the quiet darkness, as the wind whispered secrets through the cracked windows, a silent vow formed on her lips. No matter the ashes she was forced to drink, no matter the pain inflicted upon her, her spirit would not be broken. The ashes would not bury her, they would be the fuel for her rise. The night wore on, shadows dancing against the walls as the wind carried the promise of change. Amara sat alone in the silence, the taste of ashes lingering in her mouth, feeling the weight of her chains but also the first stirrings of a power that might one day burn away the darkness. The cruel ritual was meant to diminish her, but instead, it began the story of a woman who would rewrite her fate, and in doing so, burn his name into the wind. The man who held Amara captive was a figure as cold and unforgiving as the ashes he forced her to swallow. His name was Kofi, a man whose presence commanded fear and obedience throughout the village. From the moment he arrived in the settlement, his ambition was clear. He would bend the world to his will, and nothing, not even compassion or mercy, would stand in his way. Kofi was a towering figure, both physically and in the eyes of the villagers. His sharp features and piercing gaze seemed to cut through the very soul of anyone who dared meet them. But beneath this intimidating exterior lay a mind twisted by paranoia and a relentless hunger for control. He ruled his household with an iron fist, wielding fear like a weapon to keep everyone in line, especially Amara. Jealousy was one of the firebrands that fueled Kofi's cruelty. He was a man who could not tolerate the slightest hint of independence or affection that was not granted by him alone. Amara's past, her gentle spirit, her wisdom, and the love she had once shared with others, threatened the fragile ego he nurtured. To Kofi, any spark of hope or defiance within her was an act of rebellion that had to be crushed immediately. His need for domination was wrapped tightly with the superstitions that permeated village life. Kofi believed in the power of ancient curses and dark magic, and he saw himself as the sole arbiter of fate within his domain. This belief justified his brutal actions in his mind. By forcing Amara to drink ashes, a ritual steeped in symbolic death, he convinced himself he was cleansing her of some unseen impurity, protecting his honor and the village's fragile balance. But cruelty was not the only tool in Kofi's arsenal. He was a master manipulator, skilled in twisting words and emotions to keep Amara isolated and powerless. He sowed seeds of doubt in her mind, telling her that no one else cared, that she was destined to suffer alone. This psychological torment was as damaging as the physical abuse, wearing down her spirit day by day. Yet, despite his oppressive grip, Amara's resilience remained unbroken. Though beaten and burdened, there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a flicker of resistance that Kofi could neither see nor fully understand. She endured not because she accepted her fate, but because somewhere deep inside, a fire still burned. Her silent defiance was a challenge to his reign, a reminder that no matter how tightly he tried to bind her, the human spirit could not be so easily extinguished. Kofi's cruelty was not born from pure malice alone. It was also a reflection of his own fears and insecurities. His harshness masked a deep vulnerability, fear of losing control, of being powerless in a world that was slowly changing around him. This fear made him dangerous, for it drove him to commit acts that were both calculated and desperate. As the village whispered about the strange occurrences surrounding Amara, Kofi's grip only tightened, convinced that the power he wielded was absolute. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. The man who forced ashes down a woman's throat was a tyrant on the brink of losing everything, blinded by his own darkness even as a storm of change gathered just beyond his reach. In this brutal dance of power and survival, Amara and Kofi stood as stark opposites. She a flickering flame of hope and endurance. He, a shadow of fear and domination. Their fates were entwined in a tragic struggle, one that would not only test the limits of cruelty but also reveal the untamable strength hidden within a woman forced to endure the ashes of despair. Before the cruel hand of Kofi had forced Amara into a world of ashes and despair, she was a woman whose roots ran deep into the wild, ancient lands surrounding their village, a place where the elements themselves whispered secrets to those willing to listen. Her past was a tapestry woven with threads of hardship, resilience, and a rare, quiet power that few could see but none could deny. Amara was born into a lineage known for their profound connection to the forces of nature, the Firekeepers. Her grandmother, a revered elder, was the last in their line to wield the ancient knowledge of fire and wind, a heritage passed down through generations. This knowledge was not merely about kindling flames or harnessing gusts. It was a spiritual communion with the very essence of life, a language spoken through crackling embers and the rustle of leaves. From a young age, Amara was taught to listen, to the winds that carried messages, to the flames that burned away darkness, and to the spirit that moved between worlds. Her childhood was marked by both joy and hardship. She learned the healing arts from her grandmother, using herbs and chants to soothe pain and cure ailments. She was also trained in the subtle arts of protection and warding, skills that became crucial as envy and fear grew within the village. People whispered about the Firekeepers with suspicion, fearing their power as something unnatural, something that could tip the delicate balance of tradition and superstition. Despite this, Amara's family was her sanctuary, a place where love and strength were abundant, even in the face of poverty and loss. Her mother was a kind woman, full of warmth and wisdom, who nurtured Amara's spirit and encouraged her to embrace her heritage with pride. Together they lived a simple life, bound by the rhythms of the earth and the sky. But the winds of fate are often harsh, and tragedy struck when Amara's mother fell ill under mysterious circumstances. The village's fear and jealousy turned darker, and the whispers grew into accusations of witchcraft and curses. It was during this time that Amara's resilience was forged in the crucible of grief and suspicion. She faced the loss of her mother with a courage that belied her years, carrying the weight of her family's legacy even as the villagers' eyes turned cold and accusing. The day her mother died marked a turning point, not just in Amara's life, but in the story of the village itself. The same fear that had once only whispered now screamed, and it wasn't long before Amara found herself at the center of the storm. The powers she inherited, once a source of pride and healing, were twisted into signs of danger and darkness by those who envied and feared what they did not understand. Before Kofi's arrival, Amara had endured hardships that tested every fiber of her being. She survived storms that tore through the land, sickness that claimed the young and old alike, and betrayals by those she once called friends. Each trial left scars but also added layers to her strength, making her a woman who could endure not just the physical, but the unseen forces that sought to break her. Her secret knowledge was more than folklore, it was a living bond with the natural world and the spirits that inhabited it. She knew how to call the wind to carry away pain, how to summon the warmth of fire to guard against the coldness of despair. This connection was both a blessing and a curse, for it set her apart in a village that feared what it could not control. When Kofi forced her to drink ashes, it was not just an act of cruelty, it was an attempt to snuff out the flame of her spirit, to bury her strength beneath layers of dust and silence. But beneath the ashes, the embers of Amara's heritage still glowed. Her past was a reservoir of power that no tyrant could truly extinguish. This inner fire, born of ancient lineage and tempered by years of hardship, was the foundation of her resilience. It was the reason she survived the unbearable, the reason her breath would one day burn Kofi's name into the wind itself. Her story was not just one of suffering, but of the enduring spirit of a woman who carried the legacy of fire and wind, ready to rise from ashes and claim her truth. The ritual that Kofi forced upon Amara was unlike any other in their village. A dark, twisted act masked in the guise of tradition, yet soaked in cruelty and control. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed a mere punishment, but within the ancient customs whispered among the elders, drinking ashes carried a weight far deeper, a symbol of death and rebirth, silence and submission. It was both a curse and a weapon, wielded by Kofi to shatter Amara's spirit and claim dominion over her soul. In the village's old stories, ashes were never mere remnants of fire, they were the physical embodiment of endings. When a fire burns down to ash, it marks what once was, consumed, transformed, and gone. Yet, ashes also held the promise of renewal, a strange paradox where destruction fed future growth. Among the firekeepers from whom Amara descended, ashes were sacred, used only in ceremonies to cleanse and prepare the soul for transformation. But in the hands of Kofi, this sacred symbol became a tool of oppression. The day of the ritual was darkened by ominous skies. Kofi, driven by jealousy and fear of Amara's growing strength, declared that she must drink the ashes to prove her loyalty and break the wickedness he believed lived inside her. The ashes were gathered from the hearth where her grandmother's sacred fire once burned, a fire now cold and broken. The villagers watched, some in silent horror, others with a grim acceptance born of long-held superstitions. Amara was forced to kneel before a small earthen bowl filled with the fine gray dust. The smell of burnt wood and ash filled her nostrils, choking and bitter. Her hands trembled as Kofi pressed the bowl to her lips, commanding her to drink. The first taste was dry and gritty, like swallowing the remains of a fire long extinguished. It scraped her throat and left a metallic bitterness on her tongue. But the ashes were more than just physical matter. As she swallowed, Amara felt the weight of the ritual press against her very soul. It was as if the ashes carried with them the silence of countless voices, those who had been broken and forgotten, those who had burned out like the fire her family once guarded. The act was meant to bind her, to choke her strength and bury her spirit beneath layers of dust and despair. Physically, the effects were immediate and harsh. Her throat burned and a bitter fire spread through her chest, a cold flame that left her trembling and weak. 4 days afterward, she coughed up traces of the ashes, each breath a reminder of her forced submission. But beyond the pain, the ritual tore at her identity. She began to feel fragmented, as if the ashes were sifting through her very essence, separating parts of her from the whole. Spiritually, the ritual was a deeper violation. The ashes were believed to carry the power to silence the voices of the past, to mute the fire that burned within. For Amara, whose strength was tied to the sacred fire and the whispers of the wind, this was an attempt to sever her from her heritage, to isolate her from the source of her resilience. The ashes were a shroud, meant to cloak her in silence and submission, to make her disappear from the world not in body but in spirit. Kofi's attempt to control Amara through this ritual was also a demonstration of his own fears. His jealousy of her lineage and power pushed him to break her publicly, to show the village that she was no longer the firekeeper's heir but a broken woman, tamed and silenced. It was a performance meant to assert his dominance and quash any whispers of rebellion or strength. Yet the ashes carried a hidden paradox. While meant to bury her spirit, they also stirred something ancient within her, a dormant ember that refused to be extinguished. The bitter taste on her tongue became a spark, igniting a quiet but fierce determination. Each cough, each painful breath, was a reminder that the fire still lived inside her, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to rise. The villagers, caught between fear and superstition, watched the ritual with a mix of fascination and dread. Some whispered that the ashes would break her, that the curse was absolute. Others sensed the injustice, remembering the firekeeper's kindness and power. But no one dared speak openly, bound by tradition and the weight of Kofi's authority. As days turned into weeks, Amara's physical strength waned, but her spirit grew sharper. The ashes, meant to be her chains, instead became the soil from which her resilience took root. In the quiet moments of pain and reflection, she began to hear the wind's call again, faint but persistent. She felt the echoes of her grandmother's chants in the silence and the flicker of firelight in her dreams. The ritual of drinking ashes was thus both a curse and a catalyst. It was a cruel act meant to erase Amara's identity and power, but it also awakened a deeper truth. Her connection to the fire and wind could not be destroyed by mere ashes. Instead, it would burn brighter, a fierce blaze fueled by the very attempt to silence her. In this paradox lay the heart of the story, the struggle between control and freedom, destruction and rebirth. The ashes that Kofi forced her to swallow were not the end, but the beginning of a journey that would see Amara reclaim her name, her power, and ultimately, her vengeance. Through the smoke and dust, her breath would rise, burning his name into the wind, a testament to a fire no one could ever truly put out. The first breath Amara took after swallowing the ashes was sharp and biting, like inhaling a gust of searing wind. It caught in her throat, burning like a spark suddenly ignited inside her lungs. At first, she gasped and coughed, the acrid taste scraping her insides as if the ashes had not only lodged in her throat but had somehow set a fire deep within. But then something strange happened. Her breath didn't just burn, it burned with purpose. It was as if the very air she exhaled carried a fierce heat, an invisible flame fueled by the ashes and the pain she endured. Amara realized this power was no accident. The ashes, forced upon her as a curse, had awakened something far older, a hidden force inherited from her ancestors. The firekeepers, her lineage, were said to hold the essence of flame and wind within their blood, gifts passed down through generations, wrapped in myth and guarded fiercely. But this power had been dormant, waiting beneath layers of silence and suppression, until the cruel act pushed it to the surface in a way neither she nor Kofi had anticipated. At first, Amara kept the power hidden, unsure of its reach or consequence. She breathed quietly, feeling the faint warmth ripple through her chest and out into the air, unnoticed by those around her. But within her, a fierce storm was rising, a mixture of rage, resilience, and a newfound strength that refused to be crushed. The ashes had attempted to choke her spirit, but instead they ignited it, turning the poison into fuel for a fire that burned hotter with every breath. Kofi, proud and cruel, believed his control over Amara was absolute. But he did not understand the ancient force he had unleashed. When she exhaled quietly one night, the wind caught her breath and carried it beyond the confines of their home, swirling like a whisper that grew into a roar. It was then that Kofi first noticed the subtle change. The air around Amara seemed to shimmer, faint flickers of heat dancing invisibly, the scent of smoke lingering even where there was no flame. The villagers began to speak in hushed tones of the strange happenings around Amara. Windows cracked inexplicably, fires flickered with unusual intensity, and the wind seemed to respond to her moods, calm when she was subdued, fierce when her anger flared. Those who dared approach her felt a prickling heat, like standing too close to a fire that might flare without warning. The air itself seemed charged with a power that both terrified and fascinated. Amara's breath, the very essence of her life, became a weapon and a symbol. Each exhale carried a whisper of rebellion, a burning mark of defiance against the man who sought to silence her. It was as if the ashes she had swallowed transformed into an invisible script written upon the wind. Her story, her anger, her truth carried far beyond the village walls. The wind became her voice, speaking the name of the tyrant who tried to break her, burning it into the very air until it could not be ignored. This awakening changed the dynamic between Amara and Kofi. Where once he held power through fear and control, now he faced an enemy he could not grasp or confine. The power in Amara's breath was intangible yet undeniable, a force that could not be chained or silenced. It was a fierce declaration that she was no longer his to command, no longer a broken spirit but a blazing soul rising from ashes. With each breath, Amara felt more connected to her ancestors, the firekeepers who had lived and died before her. Their strength flowed through her veins, a legacy of flame and wind that transcended the cruelty of her present. She learned to control the power slowly, at first in small bursts, warming a cold night's air, igniting kindling with a mere sigh, shaping the wind's flow like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Each moment of mastery deepened her confidence and resolve. For Kofi, the change was a source of growing fear and frustration. His attempts to subdue Amara through threats or violence only seemed to feed the fire within her. The more he tried to silence her, the louder her breath burned his name into the wind, a haunting reminder of his failure and her strength. The very ashes meant to erase her identity became the flames that revealed it, a paradox that tore at the foundation of his power. The village, too, felt the ripple of this awakening. Some villagers, long oppressed or fearful, found hope in Amara's emerging power. They whispered that the firekeeper's legacy had not died but lived on, embodied in the woman who dared to rise from ashes. Others, bound by superstition or allegiance to Kofi, recoiled in fear, seeing the flames as a curse or a sign of impending doom. The village became a place of tension and awe, caught between old fears and new possibilities. Amara's breath became a symbol of transformation, not just for herself, but for the entire community. It was the breath of fire that could not be tamed, the wind that carried stories of pain and resistance, the spark that could ignite change. She realized that this power was not merely about vengeance but about reclaiming her identity, rewriting her story, and inspiring those silenced by fear to find their own voices. In private moments, Amara meditated on the meaning of her awakening. She understood that the ashes she had drunk were a link to both destruction and renewal. They represented the man's cruelty but also the unyielding spirit that refused to die. Her breath, fiery and wild, was a living testament to survival, a burning signature on the winds of fate that marked the end of oppression and the dawn of a new beginning. As she embraced this power, Amara began to envision a future where her strength would be a beacon, not just a weapon. She would carry the fire of her ancestors, not to destroy blindly but to illuminate paths of courage and freedom. Her breath was a flame that could warm, heal and transform, a force born from ashes but destined to blaze across the skies. Thus, the awakening of Amara's breath marked a turning point in the story, a moment where pain became power, silence became voice, and ashes gave birth to an unstoppable fire. It was a fierce, beautiful paradox that defied the darkness imposed upon her and set her on a path toward reclaiming her life, her name, and her destiny. The breath that burned his name into the wind was more than a curse-turned weapon. It was the spark that would light a revolution of the soul. The moment Kofi sensed that something was shifting in the air around Amara, a cold dread settled deep in his chest. For years, he had wielded his authority with cruel certainty, believing that his dominance over her was absolute. But now the invisible flames that danced in her breath threatened to unravel everything he had built. His power, his pride, and his unchallenged control. The man who once ruled with harsh words and harsher hands found himself trembling before a force he could neither see nor strike. At first, Kofi dismissed the strange phenomena as tricks of the mind, mere superstition whispered among fearful villagers. But when the cracked window panes and flickering flames refused to be explained away, the gnawing fear grew into obsession. He watched Amara closely, his eyes darting for signs of rebellion, searching for any weakness to exploit. Yet every glance only revealed her growing strength, a calm fire smoldering beneath her quiet exterior, one that defied his intimidation and control. In his desperation, Kofi's anger boiled over. His words became sharper, his punishments more brutal, yet each attempt to break her spirit only seemed to fan the flames within. The very ashes he forced her to drink, meant to silence her, had instead awakened a power he could neither suppress nor comprehend. He lashed out not just at Amara but at the world around him, throwing objects in fury, smashing doors, trying to drown out the fear that clawed at his heart. The villagers too sensed the change. Whispers spread like wildfire about the tyrant losing his grip, his once confident strides now marred by hesitation and rage. People noticed how Kofi's gaze flickered nervously whenever Amara was near, how his voice faltered when he commanded her, and how the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally around him. Even his closest allies began to doubt, exchanging uneasy glances, unsure whether their master's power was waning. Kofi's attempts to reclaim control took desperate forms. He forbade anyone from speaking to Amara, threatening exile or worse to those who disobeyed. He confined her within the walls of their home, chaining doors and barring windows, hoping to suffocate the fiery spirit that defied him. But the more he tried to cage her, the more elusive she became, her breath carrying that burning defiance beyond locked doors and iron bars. One night, driven by a mix of fear and fury, Kofi confronted Amara directly. His eyes burned with menace as he grabbed her wrist, demanding submission, demanding silence. But in that moment, something within him cracked. As he stared into her calm, unyielding gaze, the fire in her breath whispered his name into the wind, an invisible brand that marked him as weak and powerless. The words echoed silently yet deafeningly in the room, shaking Kofi to his core. His grip faltered. For the first time he hesitated, and that hesitation was a crack, one that widened with every passing day. The man who had once believed himself invincible now found his control slipping through trembling fingers. His nights grew restless, haunted by the heat of the breath he could neither escape nor extinguish. The power Amara wielded was no longer a secret. It was a shadow looming over his every move. Kofi's fear bred paranoia. He accused friends of betrayal, saw threats in every glance and spiraled into isolation. His authority, once absolute, became fragile, fractured by the knowledge that Amara's fire was a force beyond his reach. He began to lose the confidence that had made him feared, replaced instead by a growing sense of impotence and dread. Yet despite his terror, Kofi refused to surrender. His attempts to suppress Amara's power grew more violent and erratic. He summoned elders and shamans, seeking curses to break her, rituals to bind the fiery spirit within. But the ashes that had been forced upon her were not just dirt and ash, they were the spark of an ancient legacy, one that no earthly magic could quench. Each failed attempt only deepened his rage and despair, and with every crack in his control, the village's balance shifted. The once rigid hierarchy wobbled under the weight of a power that was both intangible and unstoppable. Kofi's fear was a mirror reflecting his own vulnerability, a chasm opening beneath his feet that threatened to swallow him whole. Amara, sensing the cracks in his control, stood taller. Her breath, burning his name into the wind, was no longer just a whispered defiance but a roaring anthem of liberation. With every faltering step Kofi took, her power grew stronger, not just within her but in the hearts of those who witnessed her rise. In the end, the man's fear was not just of Amara's power, it was the fear of losing himself, losing the cruel throne he had built on ashes and silence. And as the flames of rebellion blazed ever brighter, Kofi's reign began to crumble, piece by piece, consumed by the very fire he had tried so hard to control. Amara's journey through darkness and control was not a solitary path. In the shadowed corners of the village and the hidden depths of the nearby forest, there were those who quietly watched over her, individuals bound by loyalty, ancient wisdom, or quiet rebellion against the tyrant's cruelty. These allies, few but steadfast, became the unseen pillars supporting her in ways both practical and mystical, weaving a network of hope and strength around her as she faced the storm. Among her closest confidants was her childhood friend, Lela, a woman whose fierce spirit had never bowed to fear or oppression. Lela's sharp eyes and steady heart had witnessed Amara's suffering from the earliest days, and though she dared not openly defy Kofi's rule, she found ways to send small comforts: a fresh meal left at the doorstep, whispered words of encouragement carried on the wind, a secret message carved into the bark of a tree. Lela understood that resistance needed patience and subtlety, and she was willing to risk everything for her friend's freedom. Beyond human allies, there were whispers of a mysterious figure known as Anaya, a healer and keeper of ancient lore living deep within the forest's embrace. Anaya's name was spoken only in hushed tones, accompanied by tales of her uncanny ability to commune with the elements and spirits. When Amara's breath began to kindle fire and wind, it was Anaya who deciphered the true nature of her power, a legacy inherited from a forgotten line of guardians who wielded the elements not as weapons, but as protectors of balance and justice. Anaya's teachings were cryptic yet profound. Through secret meetings under the veil of night, she revealed to Amara the ritual ways to channel her breath, to transform the burning force within into a shield rather than a sword. She spoke of ancient pacts between humans and nature, of the ashes being not just remnants of destruction, but seeds of renewal when embraced with courage and wisdom. Each lesson brought Amara closer to mastering the volatile energy that surged inside her, helping her shift from victim to wielder of power. Meanwhile, a quiet figure from Amara's own bloodline stepped forward, her grandmother's elder sister Mara, whose fading years had not diminished the sharpness of her insight. Mara carried with her the weight of family secrets, tales passed down in whispers, of curses and blessings intertwined across generations. She revealed the truth behind the ashes, their dual nature as both a binding curse imposed by the man's cruelty and a dormant force waiting to be awakened by a spirit brave enough to claim it. Mara's presence was both a comfort and a challenge. Her stern guidance pushed Amara to confront not only the external chains imposed by Kofi but also the internal fears and doubts threatening to consume her. Through Mara, Amara learned the importance of understanding one's roots and embracing the complexities of her heritage, rather than rejecting it in shame or fear. Not all support came from the living. The village itself seemed to harbor subtle signs of protection. Animals that crossed Amara's path at crucial moments, sudden gusts of wind scattering her enemies' threats, and stars that shone brighter on nights when her resolve faltered. These elements, intangible yet undeniable, hinted at an unseen harmony aligned with her cause. It was as though nature itself had taken notice of her plight, offering quiet aid in the face of darkness. Even within the walls of her imprisonment, small acts of kindness emerged. A young servant, quietly disillusioned with Kofi's cruelty, slipped messages of hope and clues to the outside world. These acts were dangerous, whispered risks against a backdrop of suspicion and punishment, but they forged a lifeline for Amara, connecting her to a world beyond the suffocating walls. Together, these allies formed a tapestry of resistance, each thread woven with courage, secrecy, and belief in a future where Amara's power would no longer be a curse but a beacon. Their support was not only a practical shield but a reminder that even in the darkest nights, no soul is truly alone. This collective strength nurtured Amara's awakening, guiding her as she prepared to confront the tyrant who sought to extinguish her flame and reclaim her rightful place, not just as a survivor, but as a force of change and renewal. The air in the village was thick with a charged silence, an unspoken tension that pressed against every corner and crevice. For weeks, whispers had spread like wildfire, rumors of a power awakening in Amara, the woman the tyrant Kofi had tried to break with his cruel rituals. Now, the inevitable confrontation loomed, a collision not just of two people, but of elemental forces and shattered spirits seeking justice and freedom. Amara stood at the edge of the clearing outside Kofi's compound, her breath steady despite the storm raging inside her. The ashes she had been forced to swallow had transformed her, igniting a power she was still learning to control. Her allies had whispered warnings and offered guidance, but this moment was hers alone. She could no longer hide behind shadows or secrets. The time had come to face Kofi, to reclaim her voice and burn away the chains of fear. From the compound, Kofi emerged like a shadow birthed from darkness itself. His eyes blazed with a mixture of rage and disbelief, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had ruled with fear for far too long. Yet beneath that facade, Amara sensed cracks, an unsteady heartbeat beneath the tyrant's armor, the flicker of doubt that comes when control slips from grasp. He had heard the stories, seen the signs, and feared what her newfound power meant for his reign. The villagers gathered at a cautious distance, their faces a mixture of hope and dread. Some had suffered under Kofi's brutal hand, others held on to fear as tightly as faith. Now they watched as the two figures faced each other, the oppressive force of tyranny and the fierce flame of resistance. Kofi broke the silence first, his voice booming through the clearing. "You think your tricks and whispered legends can undo me? You are nothing but a flame that will burn out, leaving only ashes behind." His words were venomous, but Amara felt no fear, only the fierce resolve that had carried her through darkest nights. Her breath caught, and as she exhaled, a flicker of fire danced at her lips, small but undeniable. "I am more than ashes," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear. "I am the wind that carries the flame. You cannot silence what you do not understand." The battle began not with swords or fists but with wills clashing invisibly in the charged air. Kofi lunged forward, his hands aiming to grasp and subdue, but Amara moved with a grace born of desperation and power. Each breath she drew fed the fire within, her exhalations swirling into gusts that pushed back the tyrant's advances. Kofi snarled, his rage fueling a dark energy that twisted around his limbs like shadowy chains. He unleashed curses and threats, attempting to break her spirit with words as sharp as knives. Yet with each attack, Amara's breath grew stronger, burning his name into the wind, each syllable a spark of defiance that spread through the clearing. The villagers gasped as flames flickered on the breeze, dancing like living embers that refused to be extinguished. Amara's eyes glowed with an inner fire, the power of generations awakened and unleashed. She summoned the strength of her ancestors, the teachings of Anaya and Mara, channeling the elemental forces that had whispered to her in moments of solitude. Kofi stumbled as the wind howled around him, the very air seeming to reject his cruelty. His control waned and panic flickered in his eyes, an unfamiliar weakness that made him lash out with increasing desperation. He cast shadows that writhed like serpents, trying to bind her with fear and doubt, but Amara's breath shattered the illusions, her fire burning through the darkness. Their battle wove through the night, a tempest of fire and wind, cruelty and courage. Each strike and parry was more than physical. It was a struggle for the soul of the village, the breaking of ancient chains, the reclamation of a future long stolen by oppression. As dawn approached, exhaustion threatened to claim them both. Yet Amara felt a surge of power, something deeper than anger or fear. It was a fierce love for the life she had lost, the freedom she sought, and the truth she would never surrender. With a final breath, hotter and fiercer than before, she burned Kofi's name into the rising wind, a blaze of light that scattered the shadows and left the tyrant broken and exposed. Silence fell over the clearing. Kofi lay defeated, his reign of terror ended by the very power he sought to crush. Amara stood tall, her breath steady but her spirit soaring. The villagers, once fearful, now saw her not as a victim but as a beacon of hope and change. In the aftermath, the wind carried her story far beyond the village, a tale of resilience and justice written not in blood but in flames, an eternal reminder that even in the darkest moments, the breath of fire can ignite a revolution. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and something far heavier, the weight of truth long buried beneath layers of fear, silence, and cruelty. In the quiet aftermath of the fiery confrontation between Amara and Kofi, the village itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter of a story that was far from over. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, whispers began to spread, whispers of revelations long hidden, of secrets that had festered in the shadows like a slow poison. The ashes Amara had been forced to drink were not merely a cruel ritual to break her spirit, they were part of an ancient curse, a dark tradition tied to Kofi's own ancestors, designed to control and silence the women who dared to rise. Amara had uncovered the truth piece by piece, guided by the wisdom of elders who had once dared to question Kofi's tyranny. The ashes were made from the remains of burned herbs and bones, mixed with powders harvested from plants thought to sap a person's will and vitality. The ritual was meant to bind the woman's spirit, to render her voiceless and powerless, trapped within herself like a flickering candle in the wind. But the curse had backfired. Instead of crushing Amara, the ashes awakened something within her, a hidden flame connected to her bloodline, a power ancient and fierce. This power was the breath of fire she had wielded against Kofi, a force of nature that could not be caged or silenced. The village elders gathered cautiously around Amara, their faces etched with a mixture of reverence and fear. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of generations past when similar rituals had been used to suppress women with gifts or knowledge that threatened the established order. Kofi's cruelty was a continuation of these dark traditions, but his arrogance had blinded him to the strength that could rise from ashes. Justice, it seemed, was no longer a distant hope but a living, breathing force that now walked the village streets with the calm certainty of the wind. Kofi's fate had been sealed the moment Amara's breath burned his name into the air, scattering his power like leaves in a storm. His defeat was not just physical but spiritual, a dismantling of the dark legacy he had tried to uphold. The wind carried his name beyond the village, a relentless reminder that tyranny cannot stand when faced with courage and truth. In the days that followed, the villagers began to reclaim their homes and their lives. The shadow of fear that had hung over them was lifted, replaced by a cautious but growing hope. Amara, once silenced and oppressed, became a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the power of standing against injustice. She did not seek revenge. Her victory was not one of hatred but of transformation. The ashes she once drank had become the soil from which new strength grew, and her breath, once a tool of defiance, now carried the promise of healing and renewal. In the heart of the village, a fire was lit, not to burn or destroy but to honor the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. Around it, people gathered, sharing stories and songs that celebrated the end of an era and the beginning of another. Children listened wide-eyed as elders recounted the tale of the woman who turned ashes into fire, and how the wind carried justice when human hands could not. Kofi's name became a cautionary tale whispered on the wind, a warning to those who would seek to dominate through cruelty and fear. The ritual of ashes was forever changed, remembered not as a tool of oppression but as a lesson in resilience and the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of legacies. Amara's journey was far from over, but the path ahead was clearer now. With allies by her side and the strength of her ancestors in her heart, she began to rebuild, not just her own life but the very soul of the village. The wind continued to blow, carrying stories, hopes, and the promise that no matter how deep the ashes fall, a fire can always rise from within. And in that fire burned the eternal truth, that justice, once awakened, is unstoppable. The village, once shrouded in silence and fear, now stirred with a quiet energy, a breath of fresh air carrying new hopes and the promise of change. Amara's victory over Kofi was not merely the end of a dark chapter. It was the beginning of a profound transformation for both her and the people around her. In the days that followed the confrontation, the ashes that had once symbolized pain and subjugation began to take on a new meaning. They became a powerful symbol of renewal, the remnants of what was broken but also the fertile ground from which strength and freedom could grow. Where once the ashes had been forced down Amara's throat as a cruel punishment, now they were honored as the catalyst that awakened a fire no one could extinguish. Amara herself changed in ways both subtle and profound. Freed from the chains of fear and oppression, she stepped into her own power with a grace that inspired those around her. No longer silent, she spoke with a voice that carried the weight of truth and the lightness of hope. The villagers, many of whom had once cowered under Kofi's tyranny, found in her a beacon of courage and resilience. The winds that swept through the village seemed to echo this transformation. They whispered through the trees and danced across the fields, carrying stories of the woman who had turned ashes into flame and breath into justice. Children played beneath these winds, their laughter a melody of newfound freedom, while elders nodded knowingly, remembering that the cycles of nature, like the cycles of human life, always hold the promise of rebirth. The community began to heal. Old wounds, though still tender, were tended with care and understanding. Where suspicion and silence had reigned, dialogue and forgiveness slowly took root. Amara's story became a shared narrative, one that transcended individual pain to become a collective testament to endurance and hope. Women in the village, long silenced by fear and tradition, found their voices rekindled. Inspired by Amara's strength, they came together to support one another, forging bonds that would protect future generations from the darkness that once loomed so large. The ashes, once a symbol of their oppression, were now embraced as a reminder of the power that lies dormant within every soul, waiting for the right moment to ignite. Amara's breath, once a weapon born of suffering, became a symbol of liberation. It was said that when the wind blew softly through the village, one could almost hear the echo of her fiery spirit, a gentle reminder that no force of cruelty could ever truly silence the human heart. As seasons turned, the village flourished in ways that surprised even the oldest inhabitants. Crops grew more bountiful, the air seemed sweeter, and the once shadowed paths were filled with light. Visitors from neighboring lands came to hear the story of the woman who had faced ashes and emerged aflame, carrying with them tales of transformation that spread like wildfire. Amara herself chose not to hold on to bitterness or revenge. Instead, she focused on nurturing the future, teaching the children, guiding the community, and preserving the ancient knowledge that had helped her survive. Her life became a living testament to the idea that even the harshest trials could be transformed into sources of strength and beauty. The wind continued to carry her story far beyond the village borders, inspiring others who faced their own struggles. It became a legend not just of survival but of thriving, a reminder that the ashes of yesterday could be the foundation of tomorrow's fire. In quiet moments, when the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with colors of dusk, Amara would stand at the edge of the fields and feel the breeze on her face. It was a breath of freedom, a whisper of the journey she had endured, and a promise of all that was yet to come. Her life, once marked by cruelty and silence, was now a song of resilience and hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to rise, to heal, and to shine. And so, beneath the ever-turning sky, the village breathed again, renewed, reborn, and ready to face whatever winds the future might bring, with courage kindled by the ashes of the past and the fierce breath of new beginnings.